It is a wonderful honor to welcome Samuel Goldman on this podcast. He is the Associate Professor of Political Science at the George Washington University at Washington, D.C., of course. And he is the editor of a new online journal titled Fusion in the Tradition of Liberty. And that will be our focus for this hour. Sam, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Very well. Thank you for having me.
All right. So I should like to begin by asking about the American Institute for Economic Research, which I believe is affiliated with the journal.
The
Uh,
journal, yes, Fusion is sponsored by AIER.
okay. I talked to Samuel Gregg, who works there, and from what I've heard of him, that seems to be a wonderful place to be. So tell me a bit about the Institute.
Well, so I should say that I'm not really a representative of AIER. I'm not a full-time employee or fellow, so I don't speak for them. My involvement began about a year ago when Will Ruger took over as president of the Institute. And Will and I had discussed really for several years our feeling that there was space in the intellectual marketplace for a serious journal, as we put it, in the tradition of liberty. And when Ruger took over at AIER, that made available resources for us to proceed.
Okay. Now, if you hear from, I suppose, the post-liberal critics of I guess, suppose liberalism or the current American political landscape, liberty and tradition do not uh, go well with one another. So, from the mission statement of Fusion, liberty has a tradition. So, what is it?
Yeah, so the name Fusion is a tribute to the effort of some of the leaders of the conservative intellectual movement in the 1950s and 60s, and particularly Frank Meyer, who developed the idea that the American political tradition at its best was driven by a dynamic tension between liberty or freedom, especially the sort of negative freedom of the individual, and tradition, particularly the influence of religion. Um, and what we're trying to do is to restore attention to this idea, which I think has not been widely properly understood by its critics and maybe even some of its advocates. So when you read references to so-called fusionism, which, by the way, is not a term that Meyer chose or particularly liked, you get the sense that it is just a way of describing the kind of pragmatic alliance among different factions in mid-century America. And usually the story goes there were um, foreign policy hawks, motivated by anti-communism. There were economic free marketeers or libertarians, and there were social conservatives, usually appealing to a more or less Christian vision of the proper order of human life. And, these people had their differences, but they learned to get along, and this alliance reached power with Reagan. Circumstances have changed, and it's now become irrelevant. And I just don't think that's a correct understanding of what Meyer was trying to figure out. I think his enterprise is properly understood as an attempt to distinguish the American political tradition, again, at its best, and more generally, the Western political tradition at its best, from both liberalism, and especially the utilitarian form of liberalism that became dominant in the 19th century, and a kind of traditionalist thrown in altar, or even, as people say, blood and soil conservatism. And Meyer's contention is that this is not just an arbitrary juxtaposition of themes, but in figures like the American founders, like Tocqueville, like Montesquieu, in some ways extending all the way back to Aristotle, we see in Western politics an attempt to reconcile the justified authority of tradition and the wisdom of the past with the freedom of the individual. And the consequence of that effort is not a philosophical doctrine. It's not a dogma that can be articulated in a certain number of bullet points. Rather, it is an ongoing conversation in which both sides, so to speak, have their say. But the result is greater than the lone contribution of each. So all of this is a long-winded way of saying that when we talk about fusion being in the tradition of liberty, what we mean is that we are trying to participate in this conversation and this political enterprise, which again extends back centuries and millennia, and to show that it still has something to say to us today, as I believe that it does.
Mhm. Now, yes, you brought up the allegation or the historical reading that fusionism, as proposed by Meyer, is merely a pragmatic consideration because of the Cold War. I believe I read in Yoram Hazony's new book, Conservatism, about that deals with that. And his main thesis of the book, if I can read it correctly, is that there's a difference between conservatives, which are nationalists, and liberals, which are universalists. And this battle has been going on ever since before the Enlightenment in Britain, and now between the founders of the United States. So um, Hazony and other, I suppose, post-liberal critics argue that we should return to this form of nationalism and away from, I suppose, unmoored liberalism. And so I wonder whether one can make the case that liberalism and nationalism are compatible rather than in opposition to one another.
Yeah, I mean, and I've discussed this at greater length in my review of Hazony's book for the journal Modern Age. I think, although there are elements of truth in his account, Hazony really struggles to understand and reconcile with the American political tradition as it began to emerge and differentiate itself from British politics in the 19th century. So I think he's absolutely right that there is a strand of British style. To call it conservatism is a little bit anachronistic, but I don't want to get too hung up on the terms. That is more particularist, more empirical, more, shall we say, attentive to the social utility of religion, even when its exponents were not themselves convinced believers, and really did play a significant role in the independence movement and the drafting of the Constitution. Again, I think that's true, apart from some boring historical quibbles that only professors care about. The problem, it seems to me, is that the story doesn't stop there. And in my view, the tradition that Hazony characterizes as, so I think Hazony's reading is not so much um, incorrect as it is incomplete. And what I mean by that is that he effectively stops the story of American politics after about 1800 with the election of Jefferson. And that's a problem because after more or less that time, what he characterizes as liberal themes of individual rights, of social and moral progress, of universal political principle become increasingly prominent in ways that make it impossible to remove even from the figures and institutions and movements that he likes. And I think that difficulty is most evident in his treatment of Lincoln, who in certain respects is a nationalist, and I think in certain respects can be described as a conservative, but is also a Jeffersonian in his commitment to the Declaration of Independence, not only as the foundation of American political institutions, but really as an expression of a basic transhistorical human truth. Lincoln, I would say, is in a certain sense a fusionist
Mhm.
in that he's trying to negotiate or to learn from both conservatism and liberalism and reaches conclusions that are not reducible to either. Hazoni, in my view, can't really explain that. And for that reason, he can't explain the enduring centrality of figures, including Jefferson and Lincoln, to American politics, which doesn't mean endorsing everything they believed or everything that they did. But if you try to wring the liberalism out of the American political tradition entirely, you're not left with very much to work with, or at least that's my contention.
Yes. I've had the fortune of learning a lot from Lincoln via the book Crisis of the House Divided by Harry Jaffa, amongst other
Mhm.
texts. That was like my introduction text to Lincoln scholarship.
I
And
should say, by the way, that Meyer did not like Lincoln
mm,
because he saw Lincoln as excessively nationalist and centralizing, and directly or indirectly, Meyer argued, overthrowing the division of powers among the branches of government and between the states and the national government. So once again, this sort of reflects. My effort to be in the tradition of liberty, which means carrying on the same conversation. That doesn't mean reaching exactly the same conclusions.
yes, of course. Um, yes, I believe in Hazoni's book, Lincoln is depicted as a nationalist in his efforts to bind the Union together. But in other sense, I think he's a universalist, the kind that Hazoni seems to disdain because he appeals to universal principles when making the case for the emancipation of slavery, or at least the humanity of the slaves compared to the white citizens of the United States. Um, but since you mentioned the founders, is it the case that the founders themselves have a certain form of liberalism in mind when they conceive of these United States?
Well, so first of all, we should say that the systematic use of these terms, liberalism and conservatism, postdates the American founding. And in the specifically American context, really they're a feature of the 20th century. They were used earlier. I'm not suggesting that nobody talked this way at all, but it's only in the 20th century that liberal versus conservative become becomes the central division in our political schema. So we are inevitably talking anachronistically when we use these terms. Um, that said, I think it is very difficult to deny the importance of a liberal, in scare quotes or with an asterisk, a liberal component in the founding, but also in many of the founders. They were not Kantians who had a systematic moral and political philosophy. They were not all Jeffersonians. Even Jefferson was not a consistent Jeffersonian. But they did, for the most part, believe in the fundamental moral dignity of each person independently of circumstances of birth. And further, they believed that a just society would be determined largely, if not entirely, by the responsible choices of properly formed individual persons, not the authority of history for its own sake, and not the innate or natural authority of special persons who were marked out as lords of others. So again, I'm not saying that they were perfectly consistent about this or that they had a systematic philosophy, but I think that element is inextricable. And you see it even in figures who are often cited as belonging to the conservative tendency. So Washington himself says in his letter to the Jewish community of Newport, Rhode Island, that the United States provides an example of an enlarged and liberal policy. Liberal is his word here, an enlarged and liberal policy. And the policy that he has in mind is the rejection of any religious distinctions among citizens. That's not liberalism exactly, but it is a kind of liberality that, again, Washington saw as one of the fundamental contributions of the American Republic. And he says similar things elsewhere. And just one more example from Washington. Um, in his farewell address, which is another text that's often cited as reflecting the more conservative tendency. Very likely it was drafted by Hamilton, who himself was in certain respects among the most conservative founders. Washington says that our systems of government presume they are founded upon the right of the people to dissolve governments and to set up new governments of their choosing. Now, Washington goes on to say, you shouldn't do that very often, and you shouldn't do it unless you have extremely good reasons. On the whole, he makes the case for a sort of conservatism. Work with what you have, learn to live with inconveniences, remember that nothing is perfect, don't mistake the passions of the moment from the wisdom of the ages. All of those, I think, are conservative themes. And yet, he says, in the extreme case, it is up to the citizens, which is to say, it is up to us to establish forms of authority that we can accept as responsible persons. So there again, it seems to me that the so-called liberal themes are not exclusive, but they are inextricable. You can't get rid of them and come out with something that looks authentically American. And this, I think, has been the political struggle for a certain kind of American conservative, again, going back to the founding, that really has preferred a kind of British traditional politics. And that's just not where we live.
Now, we've discussed somewhat about the post-liberal critics, and I do wonder, from your point of view, what motivates, so to speak, their disillusionment towards liberalism in general, and also what kind of polity do they imagine that would arise if, say, liberalism ends?
Well, so let me take the first part first. What motivates the criticism? I don't think the motivation is so hard to find. We have a lot of problems today. Problems including social disillusion, the sort of atomization of individuals, the subordination of more and more practices to economic logic, the decay of traditional forms of learning and cultivation. All of those are bad things, and I don't blame post-liberals, so-called, or other critics for pointing that out. And further, I don't think they're wrong that liberalism has contributed to those problems. Certainly, the underlying idea, which I just discussed, that we are the source of obligation, that we are obligated to do things because we accept that obligation. That can be deeply corrosive, especially when it's applied in ways that I think the founders and even early generations of liberal theorists didn't really anticipate. They thought of this as a model of political obligation. They didn't think that it extended to every aspect of human life. But I think it's true that, as Patrick Deneen and others have suggested, there is an expansionist logic here. If I don't owe allegiance to a king due to a circumstance of birth, why do I owe allegiance to anyone else? The problem for me is that the criticism is easy. And in fact, almost all of these criticisms are very old. People have been saying these things going back to the time of the founding and even before. The question is what the alternative would look like. And it's here, I think, more than in the criticism itself, that the shortcomings of so-called post-liberalism, and again, I say so-called because I know not everyone accepts that title. What they tend to do is compare the world that we live in and the America that we live in, those of us who live in America, um, in the first place to a highly idealized past in which all the problems we know today are juxtaposed to all the virtues, and they were real virtues that existed in the past without really reconciling with any of the problems they had that we don't have anymore. And sometimes the sort of comparison goes further and compares the world we live in to philosophical utopias, to accounts of the best regime that you find in Aristotle or Aquinas or various other sources. But of course, when you compare reality to a philosophical and in some case religious ideal, it's going to fall short. And I would find the criticisms more compelling, many of them, um, if there were a real world point of comparison that would allow people to say, look, here is a country or a community, a society living under more or less similar conditions to us that's doing clearly better. And I think that's very hard to find. And I'll give one example in particular. So one of the central criticisms of the post-liberal critique, Hazony gives a version of this, others have their own versions, is the failure of the American regime to institutionalize religion. So the national constitution famously prohibits the establishment of a national church comparable to the Church of England. The states initially, many of them did have established churches, but those were abolished by the 1830s. And people now say this is a problem. Because without some formal endorsement of religion and some direct support for religious institutions, what you get is inevitable secularization and all the social calamities that follow from that. But let's look at some points of comparison, like Britain, which is held up as the alternative, less universalist, less liberal, with the symbolic and institutional relation between church and state. These are all supposed to be the good things that will protect us against liberalism and the opposite of modernity. But Britain is more secular and in many ways more liberal in the modern progressive sense, more liberal than the United States. The same is true of historically Catholic countries where they didn't have a state church in the Protestant sense, but Catholic churches and parachurch institutions really played a central social role. Spain, Ireland, France to some extent. All these countries too are more secular, and again, in many, if not all respects, more liberal or progressive than we are. So I don't mean to reject the critique and say everything is fine. I don't think everything is fine, and I think post-liberal critics, under whatever name they use, do point to genuine problems. But to me, when I compare the actually existing United States, and I'm speaking in a sort of America-centric idiom here, to the actually existing alternatives, it seems to me that we are doing comparatively reasonably well rather than being on the leading edge of disaster. Yes, we have our problems, and some of those problems are more severe, but we also have our advantages, and those are significant too. And to me, if conservatism means anything, it has to mean a capacity to reconcile with reality, including all the trade-offs and dissatisfactions of reality in preference to utopianism, an imagination of a perfected world. Paradoxically, some of the people who have presented themselves as critics of liberalism in the name of a purified conservatism seem quite utopian to me in their reluctance to engage in real world comparison and to consider genuine trade-offs in which there's no way to be perfectly satisfied, because by gaining in one area, you are very likely to lose in another area. And both of those goals, both of those areas can be and often are genuinely important.
Mhm. Now, another stream of criticisms of, I guess, what you'd call fusionist or traditionalist liberalism, the kind that fuses I suppose, Christian religion with um, the commandments towards individual liberty is, I think, the kind of liberalism founded in the 20th century, beginning with, in America at least, the New Deal, where I think it is best articulated by someone like John Rawls, where he differentiates between political and economic liberalism. Um, while someone who rejects that is Milton Friedman, who believes that those two are inextricably bound together. Now, right now, Milton Friedman seems to get a lot of ire from the post-liberal critics. They would say that he goes too far in terms of economic liberalism. He prefers free trade too much at the
Mhm.
expense of, I guess, national borders and sovereignty. I understand that within Fusion, I read this really amazing interview with Jennifer Burns, who wrote a magnificent biography of Friedman. So, if you can, do make the case of Milton Friedman for our age.
Well, so as you're kind enough to mention, uh, Professor Burns wrote the book, and I didn't. So
Mhm.
Friedman questions can be directed to her rather than to me. I'm not a Friedman expert, and more generally, I'm not an economist, either by training or by practice. And for some people, that may be a deficiency. I actually think it's a virtue because, in my view, one of the things that did go wrong um, in the fusionism or classical liberalism or American conservatism of the 20th century is that it became disproportionately economistic at the expense of political and social analysis. Now, I don't happen to think that that is an inherent defect to what I call the tradition of liberty. You read Constant, you read Tocqueville, you read Acton. There's much less attention to economics and much more attention to social interaction than people would expect. But I do think that as a result of the Cold War context, economics became the point of emphasis to the exclusion of other things. And one of my goals as we try to promote and rekindle the tradition of liberty is to rebalance things in the direction of culture, politics, and society. Not to the exclusion of economics, but at least in conversation with economics. So once again, I'm not unsympathetic to some of the criticisms. All of that said, I find it hard to look at the world we live in and see Milton Friedman's legacy everywhere. Um, Friedman did have some clear victories, and I think in Burns's book she emphasizes his real transformation of the field of monetary economics. But when we turn to regulation in many areas of economic activity, we are more regulated than we were 50 years ago. If we turn to public spending, and especially spending on welfare programs, we spend more than we did 50 years ago. None of this reflects, to me, a kind of triumph of Friedman or other libertarians that would allow us to say everything was fine until Milton Friedman said that corporations should pay attention to their stockholders rather than society. On the contrary, I think that Friedman's lessons, many of them are still relevant. And I mentioned his case for shareholder capitalism in particular. One of the developments that has a lot of people right of center concerned at the moment is so-called woke capital and corporations devoting themselves to various more or less progressive political goals. I would be very happy if people read and listened to Milton Friedman, who reminded publicly traded corporations or the managers of publicly traded corporations that their obligation is to the shareholders, not to their own visions of a better world. So, is it possible that one could go too far in a Friedmanite or libertarian uh, direction? Sure, I think that is conceivable, but I don't think we are even close to that today. And I'll borrow a phrase from the economist Michael Munger, who teaches at Duke and has also worked with AIER in various capacities. Munger, I think, has described himself as a directional libertarian, by which he means that in most cases, moving in a more libertarian direction would be a good thing, even without accepting a libertarian account of the ultimate goal. I think that's a helpful way of putting it. Friedman was not an oracle. He was not right about everything. And if you read Burns's book, you find that by the end of his life, he was actually quite critical of himself and thought that he had misjudged certain issues in important ways. But I think we would be better off if we were more directionally Friedmanite, even if we did not, and as I've been saying, we cannot achieve a sort of classical liberal, let alone anarcho-capitalist utopia.
Mhm. Now, there's this quote that I often heard attributed to Andrew Breitbart, was it politics is downstream of culture, although Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan said it better. The central conservative truth is that it is culture, not politics, that determines the success of a society. So I guess let's talk about the American culture at this point. it is true that the most vocal cultural groups of America are those who believe that almost all aspects of American culture are corrupted by some form of bigotry or other racism or sexism, you name it. And the other, which can find their voices in, say, Donald Trump, is that there's a group of interconnected elites who are determined to undermine American culture from within, and it's the job of the so-called deplorables represented by people like Trump to save it. So culturally, where does the liberal stand in these camps?
Well, I can't speak for the liberal because for the reasons I've been describing, I wouldn't call myself a liberal, and I wouldn't describe the tradition of political thought that I'm engaging with here as liberalism. I think it has liberal components, but once again, it's not reducible to liberalism. So I'll let people who identify, as we now say, who identify as liberals speak for liberalism. But the situation you describe actually strikes me as one of the areas where Friedman and other classical liberals or libertarians have a lot to say. Um, because the fight you're describing is really not just a fight about culture, it's a fight about public authority and public subsidy. So, if we look at universities, which I think are not the only example, but are one of the central ones. The problem, or part of the problem, is that they receive enormous public benefits, and they really do. Enormous public benefits, both direct subsidies and indirect ones, and they reject public oversight. And I think that quite rightly makes people very, very angry. And I'm sympathetic to some of the more, so sort of populist critics. If they're going to take the money, and it's really quite a lot of money, they can't then say, "Oh no, you people, you can't oversee, you can't possibly judge what we're doing here. You have to support us with no strings attached." In my view, the appropriate response to that is to cut down on the subsidies and entanglements between the public and these institutions. And if Harvard wants to say, look, we are going to give up the roughly $600 million we get every year in federal grants, and that's just direct grants, not counting tax advantages, subsidized loans for students, and so on. So we're talking about, potentially $1 billion a year. We're going to give that up, and we're just going to do things our own way. I would say, good luck to them. But the fact that they don't do that means that they cannot escape public oversight and public criticism. So you and probably many of your readers, your listeners, excuse me, are familiar with Hillsdale College, which has really become, I think, the flagship of the Conservative Academy. And one of the really distinctive and admirable things that Hillsdale does is they turn down federal money and they say, we're not going to take your money and we're going to do things our way. The refusal of progressive institutions to do that is not just hypocritical, but I think makes them legitimate targets of public criticism. And if they were serious about these things, they would turn down the money. Harvard can afford to do it, and so can some of its counterparts, but they're not. They want to have things both ways. I don't want to belabor the point. We can move on to other things, but I think something similar is true um, of large charitable foundations, which receive enormous tax benefits that are conditioned on a certain remove from partisan and ideological politics. um, those restraints have eroded. And these are, again, I'm talking about really big foundations that have endowments in the billions. They want the advantages of a kind of presumptive nonpartisanship while engaging in partisan and ideological activism that I think quite rightly ticks a lot of people off.
Mhm. Yes. I'm a great admirer of Hillsdale, despite some of the positions that many of his key peoples are taking nowadays, mostly in regards to Trump. I like the fact that they have these like free online courses that I can take without charge, which are very, very knowledgeable, and they are handled by very like um, credible experts. But now my let's move on to so we've talked about American conservatism for a while now. I believe that the central trouble that is affecting the conservative movement of America today is the confusion over what Reagan was about. I think right now there seems to be a custody battle between different factions over what Reagan means to them. The neoconservatives think that believe that we should preserve Reagan's hawkism. The what I call paleo conservatives or the more traditionalists uh, appeals to Reagan's respect for religion and his call for a bigger presence of religiosity or Christianity in American public life. And the libertarians appeal to Reagan's Friedmanite tendencies, to name a few. There are other factions in that group. Um, I've been very much enlightened by Matthew Continetti's book, The Right, which he decentralizes the role that Reagan plays in the conservative movement. Uh, the the central thesis of his history is that there is a conservative movement before Reagan, and with luck or with some wisdom, we can build a conservative movement after Reagan. I believe there's this term that has been coined by somebody, zombie Reaganism, that refers to the kind of this kind of tendency for many of the prominent conservatives these days to appeal to Reagan at every turn. So I suppose now my question would be, well, what did Reagan represent, and how can we build like a politic that is not Reaganite, but
Mhm.
definitely inspired by Reagan, so to speak?
Right. Well, so I mean, I think the place to begin thinking about Reagan is by remembering that he was a politician. He was not a philosopher or theorist who was trying to develop a doctrine or sort of systematic set of arguments. He was influenced by those people, but that's not what he did. He was not a one issue activist for whom a single priority came at the expense of everything else. He was not a party operative, really. Famously, he came late to the Republican Party, and really until fairly late in his career, he was somewhat at odds with the party establishment. So what Reagan was a politician. And he was a politician who had the goal of building a governing majority. And that meant being pragmatic in his philosophy or his principles. And if you look at Reagan's actual record, you'll see that he's inconsistent in a lot of ways. And I don't mean that as a criticism. Rather, um, it's a form of praise. He tried to figure out what he could do that would be acceptable under really existing circumstances. And the other element is that he was trying to build a coalition, which never means satisfying absolutely everyone, because you can't do that. Unanimity is impossible. But he was more interested in addition than subtraction. He was trying to find ways to bring more supporters to his side, rather than to reduce his following to the purest and most devoted. And I think those are the lessons that we need to learn from Reagan. The rhetoric is familiar and in some cases a cliche. I think that field has been mined. The policy positions are not all that instructive because Reagan lived in a different world. And in fact, part of Reagan's success was that he was able to convince people that the New Deal style Democrats who were appealing to the example of Franklin Roosevelt hadn't adapted to the times. They were nostalgists, and they were. Well, now it's as long since the Reagan administration as between the Reagan administration and the New Deal. So, of course, we won't be able to apply the same policies in the same ways. What we can do is to be pragmatic, which means pushing things directionally in a more conservative way, but not getting everything overnight because that it just doesn't work that way. And also trying to build a genuine majority coalition. And this is where I think my theory of political change differs from some others, including others who see themselves as inspired by Reagan or operating in the same political lineage. Um, One theory of change is really elite focused and holds that you just need a small group of people in the right place at the right time. And it doesn't matter so much how they got there or with how much support. If they're in power, they can sort of manipulate things and make it come out the way that they want. The other theory holds that without fairly consistent majority support, at least in American politics, there are real limits, there are real constraints to what you can accomplish. And I think it's that majority making component of Reagan's politics that we can learn from today. And this is one of the problems with Trump and some of his supporters. They have just not reconciled with the fact that he's not all that popular. And if you're not all that popular, there are real limits to what you can accomplish. Reagan, FDR before him were transformative presidents because they were really popular and they won large majorities in successive elections. Squeaking in through the Electoral College is legitimate. You know, that's how the Constitution works. I'm not a majoritarian in a moral sense, but it's going to impose certain constraints. So I think the question politicians should ask themselves, and not only politicians, but those engaged in political movements, is how can we attract more supporters without compromising on the things that are most important to us? Again, rather than pursuing ideological purity or personal loyalty um, at the expense of practical cooperation.
Now, as we are speaking, the news came out about the Iowa GOP caucus, and it turns out that Trump has the lead with 51% of the vote, if I read correctly.
So I think that's right, something like that.
That shows that even though he may not be that popular in the country in general, he's still quite popular in the Republican Party, and I think it should be a point of concern to both of us who think that the Republican Party is a worthy party of contention, if not government. Um, perhaps, given all of his bad qualities, Trump knows like how to like apply his ear to the ground and see like what is going on. But I think I've read in a Churchill quote that a politician that spends his time applying his ear to the ground does not like provide an appealing posture at all. Um, the other person who intends to vote for him may find that unappealing. Um, and I think that's also the issue with Trump. He does not provide a sufficiently inspiring vision for American politics to move forward. Um, his, as you've have alluded to, his brand is more personal loyalty than actual governing interests. So, what are some of the ways in which the GOP can harness, so to speak, this energy behind Trump while simultaneously downplaying Trump's influence?
Um, I mean, Trump ate the Republican Party. And I'm not sure that at this point it even makes sense to speak of a coherent Republican Party or even a coherent Democratic Party. I mean, one of the challenges in American politics right now is that for a century, basically, we've systematically undermined the parties as autonomous institutions, and now we wonder why it seems like things are out of control and the establishment or the elite has no influence. For a series through a series of reforms going back to the direct primary, we've tried to make parties irrelevant and to increase the influence of ordinary voters, more recently, ordinary donors. Um, this is the result. So I don't think there's going to be much harnessing or channeling. Trump will do what he wants to do, which probably means what he wants to do at any given moment, rather than as a sort of systematic long-term agenda. And I think that other elected Republicans or political professionals will try to get the best deal that they can, get it as much as they can out of a second Trump administration as possible, and they'll sort of keep their fingers crossed as far as the dangers of his return to power. Um, I'd be lying if I said I knew what was going to happen. I can tell plausible stories of both the more apocalyptic and more reassuring kind, but I just don't know.
Okay, so I think one more question to end on. Many post-liberal critics mention the term the common good, which they denote as something that every individual should either strive for or should cherish. And they believe that this idea of the common good runs against the kind of individual self-realization that is proposed by people like John Stuart Mill. Um, and I wonder, is the tradition of liberty allow for a common good to exist?
That's a great question, and I think it shows why the tradition of liberty and the American political tradition at its best is distinct from both the systematic utilitarian liberalism of the 19th century, and a more traditional European form of conservatism. So this is one of the issues where I think there's a distinction between the end of conservatism or the American political utilitarian liberalism. Because in American politics, we do see an appeal to the idea of the common good. And it's true, in the Constitution appeals to the general welfare. This rhetoric is everywhere in American politics. And in that respect, those who invoke the common good are absolutely right. It seems sort of crazy to say that we have nothing in common. It's just the aggregate of our personal preferences at any given moment. But American politics rejects the claim that the common good is something that can be figured out. That's it, once and for all. And our job is simply to defer to that understanding. Instead, the hope is that we can discover the common good through a process of civic participation and negotiation. We don't know exactly what it is at the beginning of the process. We know what we want. We might even know what we conceive to be the common good, but we also know that other citizens, other factions want other things and have different conceptions. And through the process of election, of legislation, of negotiation, sometimes also of litigation, we figure out what the common good actually is, even though we didn't know in advance. Now, critics will say, okay, that's merely procedural. What you're saying is the common good sort of follows automatically and spontaneously from certain rules. And if we follow the rules, bam, whatever we decide on is going to be the common good. I don't think that's right, actually. Rather, I think it's an understanding of the common good that recognizes as part of our good the capacity to reason and deliberate with fellow citizens and to make collective decisions, and sometimes to accept collective decisions where we don't get what we want, except being in the minority or on the losing side. That is part of our good, which can't be dictated or determined in the abstract. And since we're running out of time, I'll just give one more example of why I talk about the tradition of liberty rather than liberalism. I think that understanding of the common good and of the human good that it presupposes has precursors in Aristotle and his depiction of man as a political animal. So it's not just the isolated individual who lives together with others only in order to realize some material advantage, a sort of caricature liberalism. It's also not a person formed by authoritative religious and social institution who simply and automatically agrees with everyone else about what the good is, and pursues it collectively without question or challenge. Rather, it is a depiction of traditionally free men, but now we would say free men and women who are fully developed in their faculties, including the faculty for deliberative reason or logos, and who are committed to living together despite some measure of disagreement. That is where I think we find the common good, and that's the understanding of the common good that I think is characteristic of the American political tradition. It's also the one that seems to me to be most compatible with the tradition of liberty, which acknowledges the claims of history, of religion, and of authority, but ultimately does refer those claims to the acceptance of free persons. And that's what we are trying to promote at Fusion.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you very much, Samuel Goldman, for joining the show.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.